Before we begin, you don't need to remember anything. Just get comfortable, slow your breathing, and let this quiet story carry you gently into sleep. Tonight we step into a world of grit and shadows, a place where progress had a bitter taste. The future once promised here smelled of rust and chemicals and a slow creeping fear. Imagine yourself there on that night. Your first breath would have been a struggle. Before we go further, if this journey resonates with you, please let us know with a like and consider joining our community. Your thoughts are welcome too. Tell us where you're watching from and the hour there. It is always humbling to see our family gathered from across the globe. Now set your phone aside and lower the volume. Let us begin to understand Bhopal. You must first understand a promise. Not one made between people, but a vast sweeping vow made by science to an entire nation. In the decades after its independence, India was a land haunted by a ghost. The ghost of famine. The memory of Bengal in 1943 was still fresh. A trauma etched deep into the spirit of the nation. The country's fate seemed tied to the moods of the rain. A nation of millions could not call itself free if it could not feed its own. So in the 1960s, India embraced a new creed, the Green Revolution. This was a gospel of salvation through technology. It spoke of miraculous seeds of modern canals, of chemical fertilizers, and most crucially, of pesticides. To shield the coming harvest from insects was not just good farming, it was a duty to the nation itself. Into this landscape of deep hope came an American giant, the Union Carbide Corporation, a titan of chemistry from a quiet town in Connecticut. They were merchants of the modern age. They made batteries for radios and wraps for food and the secret ingredients of 20th century advancement. They saw in India not a crisis but a chance. A market of countless farmers newly believing their hope lay in a chemical spray. It was a perfect meeting of need and supply. In 1969, the company's Indian branch broke ground on a new pesticide plant. They chose a place called Bhopal, a city of lakes and palaces, a quiet administrative heart sleeping deep within India. The Indian government was not just a partner, it was an eager one holding a major share. This was a joint venture, a symbol of a new India engaging with the world on its own terms. The plant would make a pesticide called Sevin. Its powerful heart was a chemical named methyl isocyanate, or MIC. At first, the plan was careful. The dangerous work of making MIC would stay in America. The Bhopal plant would simply import it in safe small drums. But as the 1970s unfolded, a new logic took hold. Why rely on imports when India could make it itself? A new, far more complex unit was built now. The Bhopal plant would not just mix the poison, it would cook it from scratch. To the people of Bhopal, the factory was a wonder. It rose from the dusty earth on the city's edge. A maze of shining pipes and tall towers and vast white tanks that looked like giant eggs buried in the ground. It stood for a future that was clean and prosperous. It offered good jobs in a place with few. To work there in a crisp uniform, to understand the language of gauges and valves, was to be a soldier in the war against hunger. The factory was a good neighbour. It sponsored sports and built community halls. It was a piece of tomorrow humming quietly by the town. The promise was beautiful in its simplicity. American knowledge and Indian hands joining to feed a continent. No one questioned the sharp chemical smells that sometimes rode the breeze. That was simply the smell of progress, and few noticed the makeshift settlements, the clusters of huts called bastis, that grew year by year edging closer to the factory fence. The poor, as they always do, moved toward the hope of work. The bright promise of the 1970s began to fade as the 1980s arrived. The great pesticide market, Union Carbide dreamed of, never fully appeared. Poor rains and drought hurt the farmers with little money could not afford costly chemicals. Stores of Sevin piled up. The Bhopal plant, once a crown jewel, began to lose money. And in the cold language of business, a losing asset is not a partner, It is a problem to be fixed. The answer from headquarters far away in Connecticut was universal cut costs. And so began the slow, steady decay of the machine. It was not a sudden crash, but a quiet rot, death by 1,000 small cuts. The cuts were deep, targeting the very systems meant to stop disaster. They were called efficiency, not a gamble with lives. First, the people went. The team in the critical MIC unit was cut in half, skilled engineers were let go, replaced by workers with less training. The job of maintenance supervisor vanished. With fewer hands, routine checks were skipped, safety steps were rushed. A culture of making do replaced a culture of strict rules. The plant's manual, full of procedures and warnings, stayed in English, a language many workers could not easily read. Then the machines were put to sleep. The plant was built with layers of safety nets, a sign they knew the dangers of MIC. One by one, these layers were stripped away to save money. The most vital was the refrigeration unit. A powerful cooler meant to keep the huge MIC tanks near freezing. MIC is a fussy chemical. It likes the cold and turns wild when warm, but cooling costs money. It uses power. In June of 1984, they shut the unit down and drained its fluid. The mic would now sit at the temperature of the Indian heat, which could rise past 30 degrees. The manual clearly forbade this. The decision was a quiet memo. The next defence was the vent gas scrubber. A tall tower meant to neutralise any escaping gas with a wash of caustic soda. It was a chemical firewall. To save money, it was switched to standby. It was for all purposes turned off, even if on the solution was often weak and the pumps were unreliable. It was a guard sent home for the night. The last desperate shield was the flare tower, a tall stack meant as a final resort. It would burn any gas that got past the scrubber, turning poison to smoke. The pilot light, for the flare was put out to save fuel. Worse, a pipe linking the MIC unit to the flare had rusted. It was removed for repair weeks before and never replaced. The line was dead. The final safety net was physically disconnected from the danger it was meant to hold. The plant was flying blind. The warnings came not as a single shout, but as small tremors before the quake. There were constant small leaks. The air in the MIC unit often burned eyes and throats, a pain workers accepted as part of the job. In 1981, a phosgene gas leak killed a worker named Mohammed Ashraf. His family was told he died of natural causes. In early 1982, another leak put 25 workers in the hospital. The local union wrote frantic letters to bosses and officials detailing the crumbling safety and constant danger. They were ignored. A local journalist, Raj Kumar Keswani, began a one-man fight. He wrote articles in a Hindi paper with titles like Bhopal, sitting on a volcano, and if you don't understand, you'll be wiped out. He was called a fearmonger, a sensationalist. The most damning warning came from Union Carbide itself. In May 1982, a safety team flew in from America. They inspected the Bhopal plant. Their report was a horror story in dry, technical language. It listed dozens of major problems, from leaking seals to bad training to no emergency plans. It noted the potential for a runaway reaction in the MIC tanks. It was a clear blueprint for the coming disaster. The report went to headquarters in Connecticut. It was read and noted and filed. The cost of fixing everything for a plant already losing money was seen as too high. The memo from the American bosses was clear: no major investment. The warnings were noted, and the world moved on. The plant continued its slow march towards ruin, a time bomb whose ticking was ignored by those who set it. On the factory walls, a sign in English still read, "Safety is everyone's business." The night of December the 2nd, 1984, settled over Bhopal with a false calm. It was a cool, pleasant Sunday. Families finished late meals. Children were put to bed. The city's alleys grew quiet. At the Union Carbide plant, the second shift was ending, the third just starting. a night like any other. Around 10:45, a supervisor told a worker to start a routine wash of pipes linked to the MIC unit. It was a common task to clear out build-up. The worker connected a water hose and opened the valve. The water began to flow. The entire disaster hinged on one missing piece of metal. Standard safety required a solid metal disc called a slip line to be bolted between pipes, creating a solid wall, but putting it in took time. It was a corner often cut. That night, the slip line was not there. The only thing between the water and the MIC storage tanks was some valves. And in a plant suffering years of poor upkeep, the valves were known to leak. No one on shift thought to check. They trusted the valves would hold. They did not hold. A small, steady trickle of water seeped past worn seals. It travelled down the pipes, a silent, uninvited guest. Its destination was a huge buried tank called E610. The tank was not supposed to be full. Safety rules said it must be kept at half capacity, leaving room for emergency coolant, but the plant was trying to clear its backlog. So tank 610 was filled to 85%, holding over 42 tons of the liquid chemical. The water, perhaps 1,000 litres of it, dripped steadily into this overfilled pool of volatile poison. Inside the tank, a chemical storm began to brew. Water is a violent trigger for methyl isocyanate. As it mixed with the MIC, it started a runaway reaction. The heat was helped by iron contaminants from the tank's own corroding walls. The temperature inside began to climb. For the first hour, the change was subtle. Operators in the control room saw the pressure gauge for tank 610 begin to rise. But faulty instruments were common. The first reading was ignored. The operators, understaffed and poorly trained, went about other tasks. By 11:30, the pressure had jumped. An operator went to check the tank. He could hear it rumbling. He could feel heat radiating from its shell. Panic began to set in. Back in the control room, the needle on the pressure gauge was pinned against its stop. The temperature inside was soaring past 100 degrees, then 150, then 200, far beyond the boiling point of make the 42 tons of liquid were turning into a superheated high-pressure gas. The massive concrete tank groaned and cracked under the strain. The reaction was now an unstoppable chain, a bomb that could not be diffused. There was no way out. The refrigeration unit that should have cooled the tank was silent. The vent gas scrubber that should have neutralized the gas was on standby. Its systems dead. The flare tower that should have been the last defense was disconnected. Its flame long out, every single layer of safety stripped away in the name of saving money, now failed in perfect terrible order. Shortly after midnight, the pressure became too much. The emergency valve on tank 610, the last device to keep the tank from exploding, did its job. It burst open with a deafening scream. A colossal plume of dense white gas erupted from a 33-metre high stack. It was not a gentle leak. It was a volcanic eruption. For the next 2 hours, more than 40 tons of toxic cocktail, mostly methyl isocyanate, but also its deadlier breakdown products like hydrogen cyanide and phosgene, poured from the factory into the cool night air. The gas was heavier than air. It didn't rise and vanish. Instead, it formed a low clinging cloud, a dense, suffocating fog. It began to drift, pushed by a soft southeasterly breeze. It moved like a slow, invisible river over the factory wall and into the sleeping city of Bhopal. Its first stop was the maze of poor settlements pressed right against the plant, JP Nagar Chola Kenchi. The homes of the poorest people who came to the factory for a better life were the first swallowed by the poison they slept beside. The cloud did not come with a roar. It was not made of fire and noise. It moved with a quiet, deliberate menace, a whisper on the cold December air. It was a fog born of industrial pride. Heavier than air, it hugged the ground, a low predator flowing through the narrow, unpaved lanes of the shanty towns, It poured into JP Nagar and Chola Kenchi, a silent, invisible river, seeking the lowest places, seeping under doors and through cracks in the flimsy homes where Bhopal's poorest citizens slept. The first sign for many was not sight, but smell, a sharp, acrid scent unfamiliar. Some would say later it was like burning chilies, a comparison from their own world, not the chemical truth. It was a smell that caught in the throat that caused a cough, then another. Soon coughing was a chorus rising from 1,000 huts, at once a hacking, desperate sound, the body's first futile try to reject the poison. The smell was followed by a feeling, a searing burn in the eyes. It felt, survivors said, like ground glass rubbed into their corneas. Vision blurred, then failed, replaced by a milky haze and a pain that forced eyes shut. But closing them gave no escape because the real attack was inside the gas. This methyl isocyanate was thirsty for water, and the moist, delicate tissues of the human breathing system were a feast. It turned to acid in the lungs. The tiny alveoli, the little sacs that handle the sacred exchange of gases that is life, were being chemically burned. Breathing the most automatic human act became a conscious, tortured effort. Each inhale a fresh wave of fire. Each exhale a ragged, wet struggle. Panic spreads fast, and in the Bhopal darkness it spread faster than the gas. People woke not to alarms, but to the sound of neighbours screaming. They stumbled blind and choking from their homes into a nightmare. The streets were chaos of shadows and silhouettes. Families were torn apart in the desperate surge. A father holding 2 children's hands might lose one in the crowd, turning back into the fog to find them only to be swallowed himself. Mothers clutched babies to their chests, trying to shield small faces, unknowingly concentrating the poison around the most vulnerable lungs. The instinct was simple, primal run. But where no one knew what it was or where it came from, most ran away from the plant, a logical choice, but logic had no place here. The gas was a dense, ground-hugging plume, and running only forced the poison deeper into the lungs with every panicked gasp. Those who ran often fell first. The streets and alleys began to fill with the fallen men, women, children, and the ever-present cows and goats that shared their lives, and now their fate. Their swollen bodies lying stiff among the human dead. The city's main hospital, Hamidia, was under siege. It was not ready. No city is ever ready for this. The first victims came just after 1 a.m. Then they came in a flood. They came in auto rickshaws on bicycle backs carried by relatives or stumbling alone. A relentless tide of the dying and the terrified. The emergency room built for dozens was flooded with hundreds, then thousands. The doctors and nurses faced a medical catastrophe with no name and no plan. The patients all showed the same horrific signs. Temporary or permanent blindness. Violent coughing fits bringing up frothy pink-tinged spit and a desperate agonizing fight for every breath. They treated the symptoms. They washed eyes with water and gave medicines for breathing trouble. But it was like using a teacup to put out a chemical fire. They did not know what they were fighting. The phones to the Union Carbide plant rang. But the answers were a lesson in corporate confusion. It was a tear gas, they were told, nothing serious. Nothing to worry about. Wash your eyes with water. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, the lawns and halls became an open-air morgue. The dead were laid in rows, their faces twisted, their bodies showing the classic signs of death by suffocation. The sheer number overwhelmed the city. There was not enough space in the morgue, not enough doctors to certify death, not enough wood for the funeral pyres. By sunrise on December 3rd, 1984, Bhopal was a city that could not breathe. Its air was poison. Its hospitals overrun, its streets littered with the dead. The silence after the first panic was more terrifying still. It was the silence of a city holding its breath, waiting to see who else would die. The first official death count was a careful low guess. The reality counted in the flames of mass cremations and hastily dug graves was far, far higher. This was not an accident, it was a census taken by an industrial plague. Into this city of ghosts and gasping survivors, 4 days later, flew a man from another world. He was Warren Anderson, the chairman and CEO of Union Carbide Corporation, the American executive at the very top. He arrived in Bhopal on December 7th, landing in a corporate jet, perhaps imagining a scene from a film where the strong leader comes to take charge, offer help and show control and care. He was a man used to boardrooms and shareholder meetings, a world of calculated risks and liability. He was not ready for the reality of Bhopal, and Bhopal in its way was not ready for him. The Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh had promised Anderson safe passage. Yet when Anderson stepped off the plane, he was met by the district magistrate and police superintendent. They were polite, professional, and utterly firm. Warren Anderson was told he was under arrest. The charge was culpable homicide, not amounting to murder. It was a stunning moment. For a brief flickering second it seemed accountability might cross borders and corporate chains. The American CEO was taken not to a jail cell but to the comfortable Union Carbide guest house on Shamla Hills, a green exclusive spot overlooking the city his company had poisoned. He was under house arrest, but the wheels of power far above Bhopal streets were already turning. The arrest of a top American CEO sent shockwaves through Delhi and Washington. The American embassy got involved. Business leaders worried about foreign investment in India. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's government, new just a month old, faced its first big international crisis. The pressure on the chief minister in Bhopal was huge. A series of frantic calls happened between Bhopal, New Delhi and the US Embassy. The official story later told was about keeping order. He said Anderson's presence was inflaming passions and his safety could not be guaranteed. It was a thin, almost clear excuse. The truth was a high-stakes political choice holding. Anderson might please a public screaming for justice, but letting him go would calm a superpower in the global business community. In the cynical math of statecraft, the choice was sadly predictable. After just 6 hours in custody, a deal was made. Warren Anderson would be released on bail. The amount was 25,000 rupees, then about $200. It was a sum so small, so utterly mismatched to the scale of ruin, that it was its own deep insult. It was less a bail bond and more a fee for escaping justice. The legal steps were done fast. Anderson, the man leading the corporation responsible for thousands of deaths and countless suffering, paid his tiny sum. He was then led from the guest house, not in a police van, but in a government car with a government driver. He was taken straight to Bhopal Airport. A state government plane waited. It flew him to Delhi. From there he caught a flight back to the United States, leaving the reach of Indian law forever. He would never return. His leaving was not a secret escape. There were no fake papers or hidden border crossings. It was a state-approved, officially helped flight from accountability. The very authorities meant to prosecute him had acted as his travel agents. For the survivors in Bhopal, this was the second great betrayal. The first by the company that poisoned them. The second by the government that let the man in charge walk away. Years later, Indian courts would repeatedly call for Warren Anderson to face trial. He would be called a fugitive and absconder. But these were just words on paper, echoing uselessly across oceans. He lived his life in quiet comfort in the United States. In places like Connecticut and the Hamptons, a world away from the gas-ravaged slums of Bhopal. He died in a nursing home in Florida in 2014, a free man who never spent a single night in a real jail cell for his part in the world's worst industrial disaster. The fugitive CEO had won his victory was a stark lesson in the geography of power, where justice for the poor is often just a bargaining chip for the powerful. While the human agent of the disaster got away clean, the chemical agent stayed an invisible, lingering poison. To understand what happened to Bhopal, you must understand the nature of its killer methyl isocyanate, or MIC. It is a deceptively simple molecule, a volatile, colourless liquid with a low boiling point. On a cool night, it becomes a vapour with ease. It is not itself a final product, it is a building block used to make the pesticide Sevin. It is also breathtakingly toxic, and it has a fatal love for water. When the 42 tons of MEC escaped from tank 610, it was not a passive cloud, it was an aggressive reactive chemical, hunting for moisture. It found it first in the damp night air, but its most devastating reactions happened inside the human body. The body, after all, is mostly water. Upon touching the moist tissues of the eyes, nose, throat and lungs, MEC reacts with water. It breaks down, forming other compounds and crucially releasing intense heat in a fiery reaction. This is what caused the chemical burns. The gas was not just pushing out oxygen, it was actively cooking the delicate lung tissue from the inside. This rapid, violent reaction led to massive pulmonary edema. The lungs, in self-defense, flooded themselves with fluid. People were not just suffocating, they were drowning on dry land in their own bodily fluids. The searing pain was from the gas dissolving the very cells of the breathing passages, turning healthy pink lung tissue into scarred, useless mass. But the story of the killer gas is more complex than just MIC Union Carbide in the days after. And for years to come held a simple, firm line: only MIC was released. It was a tidy story, one that helped limit their legal blame. But the evidence on the ground told a different, far darker tale. The runaway reaction inside tank 610 was not a gentle boil over. It was a violent high-temperature event. The pressure and heat gauges had failed or were ignored, but later study suggested the temperature inside likely shot past 200 degrees and maybe much higher. At these temperatures, MEC does not just turn to gas, it decomposes, it transforms, it can break down and recombine into a witch's brew of other, even deadlier chemicals. Doctors in Bhopal began seeing strange signs. Many of the dead had a peculiar bright cherry red colour to their blood and organs. This was not a sign of MIC poisoning. It was, however, the textbook clinical sign of cyanide poisoning. Cyanide kills differently. It attacks the blood's ability to carry oxygen to cells, leading to a kind of cellular suffocation. The body is starved of oxygen at the most basic level. Other experts thought the great heat could have also made deadly phosgene gas an own chemical weapon from World War I and nitrogen oxides, the gas cloud. That smothered Bhopal was likely not one chemical, but a toxic cocktail of awful complexity and lethality. This science debate was not just academic, it had life or death consequences. There is a known antidote for cyanide poisoning: an injection of sodium thiosulfate. It works by helping the body detoxify the cyanide in the chaotic days. After the leak, some doctors suspecting cyanide gave the antidote. They reported remarkable, almost instant improvements in their patients. But when Union Carbide's own medical team came from America, they publicly strongly dismissed the cyanide idea. They called the use of sodium thiosulfate quackery and told local medical officials to stop their official stand. Was that only MIC was involved and it had no known antidote. The local administration, overwhelmed and trusting the supposed of the big company, followed this advice. The mass use of the antidote stopped. It is a choice that haunts the medical world to this day. How many lives could have been saved? How much pain could have been eased if the cyanide idea had been followed? Not suppressed, it was a moment where corporate damage control seemed to come before public health. The gas, in all its horrific detail, did not just kill quickly. It was a poison that knew how to wait for the hundreds of thousands of survivors. The night of December 2nd was not the end, but the start of a lifetime of sickness. The damage was deep, hidden, and often passed to the next generation. The lungs were the main battleground. Survivors were left with scars, if lung tissue or permanent loss of breath that left them gasping after the smallest effort. Chronic bronchitis emphysema asthma became common in the affected areas. The eyes, having suffered the first chemical burns, were prone to constant conjunctivitis, find early cataracts and partial or full blindness. But the poison did not stop at lungs and eyes. It crossed into the brain, nervous system. Symptoms spread everywhere: debilitating headaches, memory loss, anxiety, depression, and loss of coordination. Survivors spoke of a constant tingling, numbness in hands and feet, a sign of nerve damage. The immune system was weakened, leaving people open to infections like tuberculosis. The gas attacked the body's basic systems. The hormone system was disrupted, causing imbalances. The muscles and bones weakened, and, most tragic, the reproductive system was shattered. Women in gas-hit areas suffered huge rates of miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant death. Their monthly cycles became irregular and painful, and the children who were born the generation after the gas carried the poison's legacy in their bodies. They showed higher rates of birth defects and developmental problems, a terrible inheritance passed down from one night of industrial neglect and passed down from one night. The nature of the killer gas was not just its chemical formula, it was about its long, cruel, and ending reach into the very fabric of human life, turning bodies into prisons of chronic pain and the city into a living lab of its lasting effects. The fires of the mass cremations had long burned out, leaving a fine grey dust that settled on everything, a final ghostly blanket over Bhopal. The world's attention, so sharp and focused in those first horrified days of December 1984, had begun to drift. The news cycle moved on to other disasters, other headlines. But for the people of Bhopal, the disaster was not over. It had simply changed form. It was no longer a cloud in the air. It had turned liquid, seeped into the bloodstream of a generation, and hardened into a chronic, inescapable plague. The true cost of that night was not counted quickly, but in the slow grinding erosion of hundreds of thousands of lives. The body, you see, keeps a perfect record of every hurt it suffers, and the hurt from methyl isocyanate was paid out over decades in installments of pain. The city's hospitals and makeshift clinics became permanent, the waiting rooms filled with a shuffling hollow-eyed people bound by a shared invisible sickness. The first signs, the burning eyes, the choking, the searing lungs, were just the start. Now came the symphony of chronic disease, a complex, harsh work composed by Union Carbide's chemists. The main instrument was the lung for countless survivors. The simple act of breathing became a conscious, laborious task. The delicate branching alveoli, the tiny sacs for the sacred exchange of gases, had been chemically scarred. Doctors began using a new term in their reports, Bhopal lung. It described pulmonary fibrosis, where lung tissue grows stiff and thick, losing its stretch. A breath, once an effortless gift, was now a shallow, painful bargain. Each inhale a struggle, each exhale a wheezing rattle. Chronic bronchitis emphysema and a constant susceptibility to tuberculosis became the new normalosis, became the new normal. And then the eyes, I sea lives water and the moist surface of the human. I was a welcome home for thousands. The world grew dim then. Dark, constant conjunctivitis, fine corneaed imagine. Early cataract became common. Blindness, once a condition of old age or rare bad luck, was now a regular part of life. In the gas-affected colonies, people who had known their neighborhoods by sight for decades now learned by touch and memory, their world reduced to a permanent hazy twilight. But the poison was not content stealing just breath and light. It was a systemic vandal. It had crossed the blood-brain barrier, that careful guardian of our most complex organ, and set to work on the nervous system. Survivors reported a constellation of confusing symptoms: constant headaches, memory loss, numbness in limbs, and a crippling lack of coordination. The fine skills needed for a seamstress to thread a needle or a craftsman to shape would simply vanished, melting into tremors and weakness. This nerve decay came with a wave of psychological traumas. Though vast, it defied simple labels. Post-traumatic stress was everywhere. The sudden violent memory of that night, the screams, the smell, the sight of falling bodies would invade without warning, by day and in dreams. but it was more deep corrosive anxiety, a heavy depression born of chronic illness, lost loved ones, and the total ruin of one's economic and social world. The city was drowning in a silent shared grief. The poison's most hidden work perhaps was saved for the future. It attacked the very machinery of life's continuation. Women who survived the gas cloud now faced a new terror. Rates of miscarriages, stillbirths and infant death soared in the affected communities, and the children who were born, the so-called children of the gas, often carried the tragedy in their very bodies. They suffered from stunted growth, birth defects, and a host of developmental disorders. The gas had not just killed in one night, it had poisoned the future, leaving a legacy of suffering for a generation yet to be born. The medical community was overwhelmed, struggling to understand a multi-symptom disease profile they had never met. There was no textbook for treating mass MIC exposure. Every patient was a new horrifying chapter. The Indian Council of Medical Research began long-term studies, but their findings were often suppressed or met with official indifference, a political inconvenience in a story officials badly wanted to close. For the survivors there was no closure. There was only the daily reality of their broken bodies, a constant physical reminder of a night when industry in its infinite wisdom had declared war on a sleeping city. This immense sprawling landscape of human suffering became the ground for the next stage of the fight. The battle moved from clinics and hospitals to the cold, clean world of the courtroom. The question was no longer just how to treat the poison, but how to put a price on it. The immediate aftermath saw a peculiar and ugly gold rush. American personal injury lawyers, smelling the largest injury case in history, came to be Opal. They moved through the slums and relief carts, signing up confused, illiterate victims with contingency fee deals they could not possibly understand. Men like John Cole and Melvin Belly became familiar if passing victims with constitus, promising figures familiar if passing figures promising fast American-style justice and fast American-style justice and huge payments. It was a justice and huge payments. It was a payment from a simple, correct, faultily if seen, but it was in a United States court. Repay was in a United States courtroom. The company, the truly pay, was in a United States courtroom. It was a company. The Indian government, watching this legal scramble, quickly decided to centralize the process. In March 1985 it passed a special law, the Bhopal Gas. This law made the Indian state the sole legal representative for every single victim. On one hand, this was logical. It stopped victims from being exploited by greedy lawyers and presented a united front against Carbide's huge legal machine. On the other hand, it took power from the victims in personal tragedies, entirely turning their personal tragedies into a state-owned asset to be bargained. They were no longer plaintiffs. They were statistics in a government. Armed with this new power, the Indian government sued Union Carbide in the Southern District Court of New York before a judge named John F. Keenan. The first claim was for damages over $3 billion. The fight for jurisdiction had officially begun. Union Carbide's legal plan was a masterpiece of corporate defense, a cold, calculated exercise in legal logistics. Their goal was simple: avoid an American trial at all costs. A jury of American citizens, hearing the details and looking at the Connecticut-based company, was an unpredictable and possibly ruinous idea. Their lawyers, led by the shrewd but Holman, used a powerful, elegant legal argument for a non-convenience. It is an idea that sounds complex, but its heart is simple. It lets a court would be a more suitable, convenient place to hear, even if it has power. If it believes another court would be a more suitable, convenient place. Carbide's lawyers built a tall tower of reasons why the case belonged not in the Opal. Their points were evidence, the physical plant, the wreckage, the log books was in India. All the witnesses, the plant workers, the managers, the thousands of victims were in India. The relevant law, they argued, was Indian law. To bring this mountain of proof and testimony to New York would be expensive and a logistical nightmare. They painted a picture of an American court hopelessly tangled in a foreign case, trying to interpret Indian rules and translate Hindi speech. But their strongest point was one of civic pride, a subtle, brilliant appeal to judicial nationalism. They argued that keeping the case in the United States would be a deep act of disrespect to the Indian legal system. India, they declared, was a mature sovereign nation with a skilled, capable judiciary fully able to handle a case this big. To suggest otherwise, they hinted, was a kind of new colonial arrogance. It was a kind of new colonial arrogance. It was a clever move using the language of Episcopalian respect to serve their corporate interest. They were flattering the Indian legal system to subject the victims to it, knowing full well that the discovery process, the speed of the victim. The Indian government's lawyers fought back, arguing the real place of the negligence was not the Bhopal plant, but the corporate headquarters in Danbury. The decisions, the budgets, the safety audits or lack of them all started in America. The Bhopal plant was just the final tragic stop on a long chain of corporate malpractice made in the USA. But Judge Keenan was finally persuaded by Union Carbide's logic. In May 1986, he made his ruling. He dismissed the case from the U.S. courts on grounds of forum non-convenience. The battle was lost. The whole legal war would now be fought on Carbide's chosen ground. Keenan did, however, attach 3 conditions to his dismissal. First, Union Carbide must agree to submit to Indian courts. Second, it must agree to pay any judgment those courts made. And third, it must agree to follow the discovery rules of the U.S. federal court system. A key rule meant to stop Carbide from hiding papers. For the victims, it was a crushing blow. Their hopes of fast, substantial American justice had evaporated. They were now at the mercy of their own country's famously slow, overloaded legal system. A system Carbide's lawyers knew they could navigate and delay for years. The slow grinding machinery of the Indian courts began to turn, and Carbide's plan shifted from avoiding jurisdiction to minimizing liability. They had won the war over where. Now they would win the war over how much. The case dragged through the Indian legal system, a giant of motions and endless delays. Years passed. The victims waited. Their health kept failing. Their children grew up in the gas shadow union. Carbide, meanwhile, continued its business. The Bhopal disaster reduced to a line in their annual reports a possible liability. The Indian government, facing growing public pressure and the staggering ongoing cost of medical relief, grew tired of the long legal fight. The idea of a trial that could last more than a decade was daunting. The political will for a long drawn-out war of attrition against a powerful American company began to fade. A settlement, once unthinkable, started to look like a practical if unsatisfying answer. Secret talks began between the Indian government and Union Carbide. The victims, the very people whose lives were being traded, were not at the table. They were outside, chanting and holding signs, their voices unheard in the quiet carpeted rooms where their fate was decided. Then, on February 14, 1989, the Supreme Court of India announced shocking news. A final settlement had been reached. Union Carbide would pay the Indian government a total of $470 million in exchange. All civil and criminal charges against the company and its executives would be dropped. The deal was done. The books closed. For the government and the court, it was a moment of resolution. For the victims and their supporters, it was a moment of deep, sickening betrayal. The number itself, $470 million, was an insult. It was a slice of the original $3.1 billion claim. It was an amount Union Carbide's insurance could easily cover. The company's stock price actually rose. After the news, a clear sign from Wall Street, the corporation had escaped a possible catastrophe. The logic behind the figure was even more glaring. It had been calculated on wildly wrong, outdated guesses of the dead and hurt. The court's math assumed about 3,000 deaths and 100,000 injuries. The reality, as activists and medical workers on the ground knew, was far, far higher, with the death toll climbing past 20,000 and the injured over 500,000. When you break the numbers down, the inadequacy becomes grotesque. If you spread the fall for $70 million across the 500,000 plus victims, it comes to less than $1,000 per person. This was meant to pay for a lifetime of chronic illness, for the inability to work, for children born with defects, for endless medical bills. It was a sum that would barely cover a few years of let alone a lifetime of lost potential. The settlement was, as one activist famously said, the price of a used car for a life of agony. But even that tiny sum was a distant dream, for most. The handing out of the compensation money became a second disaster, a bureaucratic plague that fell on the already poisoned. The government set up a complex system of claim courts to sort victims and give out funds. It was a process made for failure. Survivors, many poor and illiterate, had to navigate a maze of paperwork. They needed to produce death certificates for family who vanished into mass graves and medical records for illnesses doctors were still struggling to name. They had to prove how hurt they were to skeptical officials to have their suffering weighed, measured, and given a money value. The process was painfully slow. The money from carbide sat in a bank account, turning interest for the government. While the victims waited, years became a decade. Then more many died still waiting for their claim. Corruption was everywhere. Middlemen and corrupt officials demanded bribes to move files. The sorting system was random and cruel. A survivor might be labeled as having a temporary minor injury despite lifelong breathing problems and get a one-time give-up payment of a few $100s. The process forced victims to compete against each other, to exaggerate their sickness, to relive their sickness, to relive their trauma over and over and over and over and over and over and. The $470 million settlement was not an end. It was a legal and moral cage, locking the victims into a state of permanent dependency on a broken, often artless bureaucracy. It cleared Union Carbide, made an unfair figure seem right, and turned a fight for corporate accountability into a fight for crumbs. The government of India, which had named itself the sole protector of the victims, had sold their justice for a sum that, in the big picture of corporate finance, was little more than a rounding error. Justice for a sum that, in the big picture of corporate finance, was little more than a rounding error. The poison cloud had gone in hours, but the toxic fallout from the settlement would last for generations. A bitter proof that in the mouth of global capitalism some lives are worth tragically unforgivable. Little. The chase for something like justice began almost as soon as the air cleared. It would prove to be a marathon of bureaucratic inertia, a master class in legal maneuvering spanning continents and decades. The Indian government's Central Bureau of Investigation, the CBI, took the lead, building a case not of simple negligence, but of something much more serious. The charge they chose was culpable homicide, not amounting to murder, a major crime under the Indian Penal Code. It meant an act done knowing it was likely to cause death, but without the direct plan to kill. It was a charge that admitted the disaster could be foreseen, the understanding that the collection of failures at the plant was not just an accident waiting, but a result invited by deliberate indifference. Warrants were issued. The targets were not just the managers on the ground in Bhopal, but the men at the top of the corporate pyramid in the United States and the quiet, tidy suburbs of Danbury, Connecticut. The name at the top was Warren N. Anderson, the chairman and CEO of the parent Union Carbide Corporation for the Indian legal system. He was now accused number one. He had been arrested briefly on a visit to India just days after the disaster on December 7, 1980. For alongside K.S. Hub Mahindra, the chairman of the Indian branch. But Anderson's stay was short. He posted bail and was put on a state government plane back to Delhi, from where he quickly flew to the United States, never to return. The Indian government, it seemed, had let the most valuable piece in their legal game simply walk off the board. From that point, the legal process split into two very unequal paths. In India, the case against the Indian officials of UCIL began its slow grinding journey through the nation's maze-like court system, and in the United States, a diplomatic and legal dance began to bring Warren Anderson back to face those same courts. The Chief Judicial Magistrate of Bhopal, formerly called Anderson, proclaimed absconder a fugitive from justice. India sent its first extradition request to the United States in 1993. The paperwork was huge proof of the CBI's careful work. The U.S. Department of Justice reviewed the request and found it met the needs of the extradition treaty. There was, in their legal view, probable cause to believe Anderson had done the crimes he was charged with, but the choice to extradite is not purely legal, it is at its heart political. The request languished, moved between the Department of Justice and the Department of State. Years passed, a second request went in 2004 and another in 2008. Each met the same quiet, solid wall of diplomatic silence. Washington was simply not going to hand over the retired CEO of a major American multinational to face a homicide charge in a developing country. It was an unspoken but unbreakable policy. Anderson, for his part, lived a life of comfortable quiet, first in Connecticut, then in the Hamptons on Long Island, and finally in Florida, sometimes bothered by journalists or process servers, but fundamentally untouched by the Indian warrant with his name. Back in India, the wheels of justice were turning, but they were turning backwards in 1996, in a decision that shocked and horrified victim groups. The Supreme Court of India stepped in it, looked at the case and ruled. The evidence did not support culpable homicide, the judges argued. While there was clear proof of negligence, there was no proof the executives had direct knowledge that their specific act of omission, the cost cuts, the understaffing, the disabling of staffing, the disabling of staffing, the disabling of safety, would likely cause death on such a scale. The charge was therefore weakened, downgraded to causing death by negligence. The legal difference was huge. Culpable homicide could mean up to 10 years in prison. Death by negligence meant a max of just 2. It was the legal equal of reducing arson to leaving a campfire, and attended the whole weight of the corporate trons. The systemic, calculated disregard for safety was erased by a judicial pen stroke. With the charges lighter, the case lost what little urgency it had. It crawled on another 14 years. Witnesses grew old and died. Evidence aged. The public's attention drifted. Finally, on June 7, 2010, more than 25 years after the gas leak, a verdict came in the Chief Judicial Magistrate's Court in Bhopal. 7 former senior workers of Union Carbide India Limited, all Indian nationals and by then elderly men, were found guilty. The list included K.E.S. Hub Mahindra, the former chairman. The sentence for overseeing the world's worst industrial disaster, for an act of negligence that killed thousands and hurt hundreds of thousands, was 2 years of simple imprisonment and a fine of 100,000 rupees, each about $2,000. They were all granted bail from the courtroom itself. Minutes after the verdict was read, none would spend a single night in jail. It was less a punishment and more a bureaucratic nuisance, a final, almost insulting postscript to a quarter-century of legal fight. Warren Anderson's name was mentioned in the trial, but only to note he was still an absconder, a ghost in the machine who had long vanished. He would die 4 years later, in 2014, in a nursing home in Vero Beach, Florida. His death was not announced by his family, and was only confirmed by public records weeks after the man at the top of the chain, the final authority for Union Carbide's global operations, had simply faded away unpunished and unrepentant. The legal case was closed, but the crime scene stayed. While lawyers had debated the meaning of knowledge versus negligence, in air-conditioned courtrooms the physical proof of the company's recklessness had not been idle. It was slowly, methodically poisoning the earth. The Union Carbide factory did not just vanish after the disaster. It was abandoned. The Indian government locked the gates, called it a hazardous zone, and then for years did almost nothing. The site became a grotesque monument, a 68-acre proof of industrial decay. Inside the crumbling walls, nature began a slow comeback. Weeds grew through concrete cracks, vines climbed the rusting lattice of pipes and columns. The 7 plant, the MIC unit, all stood silent, skeletal remains of a failed technological promise. But this was not a harmless ruin. It was a chemical graveyard, a vast open wound, leaking toxins into the surrounding city. The disaster of December 1984 was a single acute event, a violent burst of gas over a few short hours. The disaster that followed was chronic, a slow seeping plague with no end. The problem was not just the leftover chemicals in the pipes and tanks of the MIC unit. The real environmental catastrophe lay in what had been happening for years before the catastrophe. Lay in what had been Opal plant had been a famously sloppy operation. Industrial waste, including bad pesticides, processed leftovers, dovers and dirty solvents, was not thrown as diverting bad pesticides, processed leftovers not thrown waste, and dirty solvents was not thrown away safely. Instead, it was dumped carelessly and empty, ground up and buried on slowly seeping downs, were left to rust and lined slowly seeping downs were late to let volatile liquids vanish into the air, leaving behind a thick toxic sludge. An estimate when the factory was shut in 1980 for this huge stock of poison was just left. Nobody took blame. Union Carbide said its duty ended with the 1989 settlement. The state government of Madhya Pradesh, which then took the site, lacked the money, the technology and the political will to fix it, so the waste just sat, and with every monsoon the poisoning got worse. The heavy rains would fall on the dump sites and ponds, dissolving the chemicals and carrying them deep into the soil. The water trickled down a toxic brew of mercury, lead, chromium, nickel and nitre, alphabet soup of chlorinated hydrocarbons, compounds like hexachlorohydrin and dichlorobin and cess. It moved slowly and visibly until it reached the aquifer, the huge underground water reservoir beneath the city. Once in the groundwater, the poison began to spread following natural underground flows, fanning out into the residential colonies, the bastards around the factory. For people living in community, P. Agar and coal, Akenkai, the hand pumps were a lifeline. They were the main source of water for drinking, cooking, washing, and bathing children, and for years they had been drawing that water straight from the poisoned aquifer. They didn't know the water often looked carried an invisible load. Science studies over the years by both government agencies and independent groups like Greenpeace confirmed the terrifying truth. Water samples from hand pumps as far as 3 kilometers from the factory showed levels of toxic chemicals and heavy metals hundreds, sometimes thousands of times higher than safe limits set by the World Health Organization. The poison was now being swallowed daily by a new generation of victims. This was the second Bhopal disaster unfolding in slow motion. The health effects in the surrounding communities were devastating. Unhidden people reported a list of chronic troubles, constant skin rashes, breathing problems, crippling and severe stomach issues. More alarmingly, doctors began to see clear patterns of generational damage. Women had higher rates of miscarriages and menstrual problems. There was a terrifying jump in children born with birth defects, cleft lips, missing palates, twisted limbs, and severe the liver, kidney and gallbladder, kidney and gallbladder. The factory, even dead, had become a new kind of plague carrier. The abandoned structures were the source, the soil and groundwater, the medium and the hand pumped, the delivery point, pumping a diluted but steady poison right into the homes and bodies of tens of thousands with no other water source. The official answer was again a study in paralysis. A series of government reports confirmed the poisoning, each echoing the last. Committees were formed to study clean-up. Debates raged over the best method: incineration, biomechanism, secure landfilling. But the central question was always the same: who would pay? The estimated cost ran into tens, then hundreds of millions of dollars. The state government pointed to the central government. The central government. The central government. The central government pointed back to the company, and the company Union Carbide now had a new name and a new much bigger legal fortress. The name on the rusting gate might have said Union Carbide, but by the turn of the millennium that name and all it owned belonged to someone else. A much bigger fish had swallowed the shark, and it had no plan to pay for the sins of its meat. In the world of high-stakes corporate mergers, history is often just another line on a balance sheet, a debt to be managed, minimized, or in 1999, one of the biggest such deals in chemical industry history was announced. The Dow Chemical Company, an American chemical giant based in Midland, Michigan, would buy Union Carbide Corporation in a stock swap then worth over $11 billion. The merger finished in early 2001, creating the world's second largest chemical company. For Wall Street, it was a win of synergy and market control. For the survivors in Bhopal, it was the moment their enemy vanished behind a new, taller, far stronger, while Union Carbide as an independent company ceased to be. It became a fully owned part of Dow. The ghost of Carbide now had a new host. From the start, Dow's stand on Bhopal was one of absolute and yielding legally precise denial. Their public and legal statements became a mantra repeated without fail at shareholder meetings and press releases, and in court files. The argument had three parts and was made to be unbreakable. First, Dow claimed it bought Union Carbide long after the disaster, so it bore no blame for events in 1980, for they bought the company's assets, not its historical debts. Second, they pointed endlessly to the 1989 settlement between Union Carbide and the $470 million payment they argued was a full and final settlement of all claims past, present and future from the gas disaster. The book, in their view, had been closed, sealed and filed 12 years before they arrived. Third, they said the abandoned factory site was under the exclusive control of the Madhya Pradesh state government since 1998, so any and all duty for environmental cleanup lay with Indian authorities, not a private American company. This legal wall was carefully built. Dow argued Union Carbide still existed as a separate legal entity, a subsidiary with its own board, and that Dow as the parent could not be liable for the acts of its subsidiary, especially acts before the buy. It was a classic use of the corporate veil, the legal idea that separates a corporation from its owners, shielding them from its debts and legal duties. Activists and survivors saw it differently. They argued when Dow bought Union Carbide, it didn't just buy its factories, patents and profitable plastics divisions, it also bought its unfinished obligations. They said Dow was now the 100% owner of a fugitive from Indian justice, Union Carbide Corporation, which still had an active homicide case against it in the Bhopal court. By shielding its subsidiary and refusing to make it face the Indian legal system, Dow, they argued, was blocking justice. The fight moved from the courtrooms of Bhopal to the global stage of corporate accountability. International activist groups with the tireless Bhopal survivor organizations started a multi-front campaign against Dow Chemical. They called the merged entity Dow Carbide, refusing to let the new owner erase the toxic legacy of its purchase. They organized protests outside Dow sites worldwide. They began shareholder resolutions forcing the issue onto the agenda at Dow's yearly meetings. They called for boycotts of Dow products. The campaign hit a high point before the 2012 London Olympics. Dow had signed a rich sponsorship deal to provide a decorative wrap for the main Olympic stadium for activists. The irony was too much to ignore. A company they accused of dodging duty for a disaster that killed and maimed thousands was set to have its logo on the world's top sports event. A celebration of health and human achievement. Protests exploded in London and India, making bad press and forcing Dow into defensive public relations. Dow's response was a lesson in modern corporate crisis management. They never strayed from their legal script. They framed the issue not as moral or ethical duty, but as an attempt by activists to force them to accept a debt that was not legally theirs. They painted themselves as the target of a wrong emotional campaign, ignoring the legal facts of the 1989 settlement. They used teams of lawyers and public relations experts to counter every claim, rebut every article challenge, every protest. Their message was simple: we feel for the victims of the tragedy, but Bhopal is not it. It was a plan of legal containment and reputation management, made to isolate the Bhopal issue as a historical artifact linked to a brand they bought, not as a living, breathing duty that belonged to Dow Chemical itself. The standoff created a deep, troubling stalemate. They refused to pay to clean the poisoned earth. They refused to add to the meager compensation given to victims, and they refused to use their power as the sole owner of Union Carbide to force its people to finally appear before the Bhopal court and answer the still waiting criminal charges. The Indian government, for its part, seemed unable or unwilling to use the kind of legal and diplomatic pressure that might force Dow's hand it would file new legal petitions seeking more compensation or demanding cleanup costs, but these actions felt more like political theater than a real chase for justice. The result was a state of forever paralysis. The toxic waste stayed in the ground, continuing its slow move into the water supply. The second and third generations of victims kept suffering a range of crippling health problems with little access to special medical care. The ghost of Union Carbide, now safe inside the corporate structure of Dow Chemical in Midland, Michigan, stayed untouchable, a perfect, chilling example of how in the globalized world a corporation can buy a future while disowning the most toxic parts of its past. The crime stayed unpunished, the poison uncleaned, and the duty, it seemed, had evaporated into the same thin air that so many years before carried the gas. The poison, you see, did not just fall from the sky that December night and vanish with the morning sun. There would have been a kindness. Instead, it was a seed planted in the blood and bone of a generation, and that seed, watered by contaminated wells and fed by a legacy of neglect, began to grow in the most terrible of gardens, the worms of the survivors. The story of Bhopal did not end with clearing the bodies. It was just starting its second, more hidden chapter, written in the small, fragile bodies of children who never breathed the gas themselves. For them, the disaster was not a memory but an inheritance. In the years after, the maternity wards of Bhopal's hospitals became quiet theaters of a slow unfolding horrid actors used to the normal range of human birth began to see patterns that broke statistics. Clusters of misfortune point to a lasting invisible wound in the city's genetic code. Children were born with bodies that seemed like cruel anatomical jokes, cleft palates so bad a baby could not feed, eyes missing or clouded with cataracts from birth, limbs fused or twisted, or simply not there. There were holes in their tiny heart, say literal and figurative broken-ins passed from parent. The nerve damage was even deeper. An epidemic of cerebral palsy began in the shanty towns around the factory. Little bodies shaking with spasms, minds locked behind a fog. Growth was stunted. Children who should have been running and playing were instead small and weak, their physical development stopped by chemical growth. And then, the hidden plague's hormone systems thrown into chaos. Young girls barely 10 or 11 began to menstruate, their bodies thrown into a premature, confusing womanhood. Women who survived the gas found the cycles became irregular, painful, a monthly reminder of the poison still inside. Miscarriages and stillbirths were not just tragedies, they were an expectation to carry a child to term. In the shadow of the Union Carbide plant became an act of desperate hope. The Sambhavna Trust Kin, started by a tireless activist named Satanati H. Sarongji, became a haven of data and care. Here the stories from the alleys were carefully recorded. They mapped the rising tide of cancers, the explosion in breathing illnesses, the confusing array of autoimmune disorders, but most chilling, they recorded the second generation. They treated children with learning problems, with attention deficits, with a host of developmental delays that set them apart from peers in other luckier cities. This was the transgenerational effect of methyl isocyanate. The gas was a mutagen. It had not just suffocated its victims, it had scrambled the very code of life for those who survived. It attacked the delicate structure of DNA, leaving behind microscopic fault lines, time bombs that would go off in the next generation and the next. The problem was made worse, infinitely worse, by the environment itself. The factory was abandoned, but its poisons were not tons of toxic waste, a chemical mix of mercury, lead and organ arsenic left in open pits, sealed in rusting drums. With every month seeped into the earth, they slowed eddy intravenous drip into the city's aquifer, the hand pumps giving water to the poorest neighborhoods. JP Nagarata Layab Nagar became dispensers of this diluted poison. The water had a faint sweet, industrial taste. It shimmered with an oily sheen in sunlight, and people drank it. They bathed their children in it. They cooked with it. They cooked with it. They cooked with it. They ticked with it. So the children of Bhopal were fighting the war on two fronts against the genetic damage they were born with and the environmental poison they swallowed every day. They were the living proof, the undeniable heartbreaking evidence that the Bhopal disaster was not history, it wasn't, is a continuing crime. Faced with this unending plague, with the government wanting to file the whole event under history and a corporation lost in a maze of mergers and buys, the people of Bhopal did something remarkable. They refused to be victims, they refused to fade, they began to fight. This was not one glorious battle, but a long grinding war fought in dusty government offices, on sun-baked streets, and in the cold impartial halls of justice. It was a fight for the most basic human dignities, the right to health, the right to clean water, the right to hold powerful to account. The fight was led not by generals but by survivors themselves, people who had lost everything, but they were people like Abdul-Jabbar, a man who lost his family and his health, but turned his grief into a lifetime of fierce activism, organizing followers into a strong political force, and women like Rashida B. and Kompad Evi Shukla, two ordinary housewives, changed by tragedy into extraordinary leaders. They started the Bhopal Gas Tragedy in a hill stationary Karmach, where he sang, an organization giving voice to thousands of women. The disaster casualties, most lasting casualties, most lasting casualties, most casualties. Their tactics came from desperation and cleverness. They knew the bureaucracy was made to exhaust them, to wait them out, until they matched its inertia with their own persistence. They organized marches or padai, that is, walking hundreds of kilometers to the capital, New Delhi, their slow, determined walk, a moving charge against the government's indifference. They gave petitions signed by thousands, a blizzard of paper against stone ministry walls. They held sit-down protests that could last days, weeks, even months, turning public squares into camps of resistance. One of their strongest symbols was the broom. They would stage mass sweepings outside government offices, a simple power, for lacked meaning. They wished to clean the system of corrupt, heartless officials. They became masters of guerrilla litigation, filing countless lawsuits challenging every official number, every weak medical report, every tiny offer of help. The fight focused on for clear demands. First and most immediate was compensation. The 19 Indian carbide had been a breathtaking betrayal for $170 million for what was then guessed as 500,000 victims broken down. It was a pittance for those with permanent disability, a life with permanent disability, a lifetime of bustlessness, brain failing organ down. It was a pittance, brain failing organs. The sum was often under two. Sum was off brain failing organs. The sum was often under $2,000 for those called temporarily injured. It was half the government. It was half the government owed over 3,000. It was a cruel joke. A man who coughed blood the rest of his days might find his days might fight. Second was the demand for proper medical care. The state-run hospitals were overwhelmed and under-equipped. They gave painkillers and cough syrup, treating the deep cellular hurt of chemical exposure like a common cold. The activists wanted special clinics, long-term health tracking and research into the specific diseases caused by MIC and its byproducts. They fought for the very life of places like the Sambhavna Clinic, which offered free whole care, mixing modern medicine with traditional therapies like yoga and Ayurveda to manage the chronic symptoms plaguing survivors. They fought not just for medicine, but for a health system, Third was the most visible, stubborn demand, the cleanup of the factory site. For decades the plant stood there, a rusting skeleton on the skyline, acres of poison land bleeding into the earth. The activists demanded Dow Chemical, which bought Union Carbide in 2001, accept its predecessor's debts and fund a full scientific clean-up of the site. Dow, of course, did a master clean-up of the site. Dow, of course, did a master cleaned. They only bought carbides. Acid. Dow, of course, did a master class in corporate denial. They claimed they only bought carbides. Asset. They hid behind a corporate veil so thick it seemed unbreakable. The Indian government forced the issue, scared of frightening other. Finally, there was the fight for criminal justice, the most personal and perhaps most painful battle of all. They wanted the man responsible to stand trial. Specifically, they wanted Warren Anderson, the CEO of Union Carbide at the time of the disaster. Anderson had been arrested flying to Bhopal days after the leak, only to be let out of the country. in a government plane never to return for 30 years. He was a fugitive plane in a government plane never to return for 30 years. He was a fugitive from Indian justice living a comfortable life on Leiden National Organization Houston, with help from international groups for other survivor groups with help. In 2014, Warren Anderson died at 92 in a nursing home in Vero Beach, Florida. In an Indian court for the survivors, it was the ultimate symbol of a world where corporate power could literally get away with mass murder. The fight had been tireless, but on that front had been lost, yet they kept fighting for the other Indian officials of UCIL for the principle. The fight was no longer just justice for Bhopal. It was a fight to make sure no other city would ever endure what they had. It was a fight for the future. And so the smoke from the pyres long cleared, the first chaos settled into a chronic aching reality. But the shadow of the Union Carbide factory still stretches far past the city limits of Bhopal. It has become a global symbol, a dark touchstone in the story of the 20th century. It is an unforgettable word, Bhopal, that entered the world language shorthand for the catastrophic potential of industrialization gone wrong. For corporate greed placed above human life, it stands as a permanent lasting warning, a lesson written and paid for with tens of thousands of lives. The question hanging in the air, heavy as the gas itself, is simple: has the world learned anything? On the surface, the answer seems yes, right after Bhopal sent a shockwave through the global chemical industry and the governments meant to control it. In the United States, the disaster directly caused the 1996 Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act for the first time. This law required places handling hazardous chemicals to tell the public and local emergency planners. This stopped the veil of corporate secrecy, was in theory cut. The idea community had a right to know what toxic materials were stored next to their homes was a radical idea born straight from the ignorance of Bhopal's people who had no clue. The industry itself, scared of legal and financial fallout, scrambled to make new rules. The idea of process safety management was made a complex, systematic way to find and control industrial dangers. Safety checks got stricter, emergency shutdown systems more backed up in boardrooms. From Houston to Hamburg, the Bhopal scenario became the worst nightmare, the disaster to avoid at all costs. But scratch under the surface of reform at a more cynical picture shows the core lesson. The core lesson of Bhopal was not about power and geography. The disaster revealed in the starkest terms a dangerous double standard. Union Carbide ran in Institute, West Virginia, but that plant was built with top computerized safety systems. The Bhopal plant was run by hand. The West Virginia plant was run by hand. The West Virginia plant was run by hand. The West Virginia plant with local throng emergency plan with local authority. It is a cost one that can be workers were highly trained. The Indian workers were highly trained. While rules tightened in the developed world, many companies simply moved their riskiest work to the global south, to nations where environmental laws were bendable and human life tragically cheap. The map of risk was redrawn, but the risk itself not removed. Further, the legal legacy of Bhopal is one of deep failure, a blueprint not for accountability, but for escape. The decades-long legal fight showed how a powerful multinational can use the complexities of international law. It was not liable. Successful argument. It was not liable for Union Carbide. It was not liable for Union Carbide's acts. The company it fully swallowed. The company it fully swallowed. The company it fully swallowed. It fully swallowed. Says a chilling pressed of business. The corporate veil, they're held accountability to without being held accountable for their crimes. The message to your company to you to accountability. And so the warning of Bhopal echoes today, perhaps more urgently than ever. The global chemical industry is far larger and more complex than in 1980. For the supply chains longer, the processes more hidden, and while safety tech improved, the basic economic pressures to cut corners to put profit before people have not changed. The rusting wreck of the factory in Bhopal is more than a ruin. It is a prophecy. It tells of a world where the chase for progress can become a plague, where the products promising a better life can be made through a process that deals out death. It is a reminder the most chemical is not methylisocyanate. It is a reminder the most dangerous chemical. The fight of the survivors now in its 5th decade is not just for their own small measure of justice. It is a fight to keep this warning alive, to make sure the world does not forget, because the poisoned water is still drawn from the wells. The poison is still in the ground, and somewhere in another city, another country, the same math of risk and profit is being made again tonight. The story of Bhopal is not over. It is simply waiting for its next chapter and its next. As this quiet story comes to an end, there's nothing more you need to do. If you're already asleep, may this calm moment continue gently through the night. And if you're still awake, you're welcome to keep resting here for as long as you like.